world for all. We work with the university and a global network of researchers and practitioners to build an international pool of talent, convene academic and practitioner networks, and deploy breakthrough research to address the world's most pressing challenges. It's why we are so excited about today's conversation on rethinking the global economic development architecture. This event is part of the Harvard Kennedy School's Candid and Constructive Conversations series. This Candid and Constructive Conversations initiative provides HKS students, staff, and faculty consistent opportunities to learn and practice skills for constructive disagreement across differences with the goal that all members of our community feel heard and respected. As a school-wide initiative for the next generation of public servants and leaders, the CCC programming aims to cultivate an environment of openness, humility, and respect to support the robust exchange of ideas within the HKS learning community. Before we get started, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. Please enjoy lunch, but help us help the planet by doing your part. All food items, including cups, napkins, and utensils, are compostable. Please hold all questions for our speakers until they have finished the presentation and that we've opened up the Q&A section. At the time, I will go around with the mic so that we can hear you clearly. We are also recording today's session, which is on record, but we'll keep the camera on the speaker, only ensuring that voices from the audience are recorded. The video of this event will be available on the CID YouTube channel afterwards. A CID team member may take photos of the event for use on CID's social media channels. If you are not comfortable with your photo being included, please let a CID team member know. Please use the QR codes located around the room to check into today's event. This helps the CID team track attendance and cater events for future events for our audience. Please make sure to subscribe to CID's newsletter and follow Harvard CID on LinkedIn and Instagram to learn more about our events and stay connected with the CID community. Now, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Ms. Gayle Smith holds many illustrious titles and positions as former CEO of the One Campaign, Coordinator for Global COVID Response and Health Security at the U.S. Department of State, Senior Director at the National Security Council, and USAID Administrator. Prior to these roles, she co-founded the Enough Project and the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, MFAN, and led the Sustainable Security Project at the Center for American Progress. She lived and worked in Africa for almost 20 years, working as a reporter and then for NGOs and international organizations. We are very honored to have her in person with us today, followed by her career chat with students after the talk. Dr. Vera Songwe is the chair and founder of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, advisor to the Bank of International Settlements, and senior fellow in the Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institution with Global Development. She's the co-chair of the independent high-level expert panel on climate finance and a co-chair of the Food Systems Economics Commission. She also served in leadership positions at the United Nations, Economic Commission for Africa, International Finance Corporation, and World Bank. Thank you for joining us virtually from Washington, D.C. Asim Khwaja is the faculty director here at the Harvard Center for International Development and the Sumitomo Foundation for Advanced Studies on International Development, professor of International Finance and Development at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's the co-founder of the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan. His areas of interest include economic development, finance, education, political economy, institutions, and contract theory and mechanism design. The panel will be moderated by Fatima Sumar, the executive director of CID and an adjunct lecturer in public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Fatima has had a distinguished career as a senior leader in both government and civil society on international development and foreign policy, most recently serving as a presidential appointee at the U.S. Millennium Challenge Corporation. In terms of format, the panel will focus on a few rounds of question and discussion for about 30 minutes before opening to Q&A. Thank you for all being here, and over to you.
A huge round of applause for Rahul. Thank you so much. So the reason we wanted to bring this conversation today is we have a birthday coming up. And it's not one of our individual birthdays, but we have some key institutional birthdays coming up this year that are worth thinking about both commemorating the successes, but really forcing us to think if maybe it's time for a fundamental rethink on the global stage. So as many of you know, many of the Bretton Woods institutions will be turning 80 later this year, which is a significant milestone, whether that's institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, and many of the institutions that came out of a post-World War II architecture. Now, in order to talk about the present and the future, sometimes we have to go backwards and understand where we're coming from in history. So just a scene set for 30 seconds, you know, back in the 1940s, as early as 1941, you had world leaders like Winston Churchill and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt getting together, even at the very start of the war, to think about what the post-war architecture would look like. And you have emergence of institutions, and of course, right here up in New Hampshire, for those of you that are ski aficionados or nature hike activists, going right up to Bretton Woods, where many leaders came together to lay that foundation for what would come in 1944, 45 out of the war, right? At that time, you're not just ending 2 world wars, coming out of a Great Depression. You're also looking at the breakup in the 40s and 50s and into the 60s of huge colonial empires, right? All across Asia, Africa, Latin America. So if you look in the 1960s, many of us may be shocked to realize that as our grandparents' generation, wherever our grandparents were, they could have been in Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, they could have been in Omaha, Nebraska. Most of our grandparents actually lived in poverty or extreme poverty, with 80% of the world experiencing poverty just 3 generations ago, around 80% in the 1960s. So leaders at the time had a massive job in front of them to really think about what was the global architecture needed at that moment to get us out of a very dire circumstance of the 20th century. Well, the world has changed a lot in the last 80 years. We've made massive progress, as all of us know, in getting that number down from 80% to extreme poverty hovering, give or take, around the 10% mark. We've made huge progress in large part thanks to many different things like the development agenda, but also the rise, of course, of industrialization and progress many countries like India, China, other Asian economies, Latin American economies have also made. This is where we are today. And the question we wanted to have, and as part of Harvard Kennedy School's Candid and Constructive Conversation series, there's some really hard questions both to ask, but for us to think about not just the what, but the how. What does the next 80 years for us look like? Who gets to decide? And how does it actually get implemented? So we are really honored because we have 3 both amazing thinkers and doers with us today who bring very different perspectives across a range of the worlds of research and practice to help us think this through. So what I'd like to do with your collective permission is both invite you to put some ideas out there, invite you to test each other out though, and either disagree or push each other on your thinking as we model what conversations can look like when we're trying to solve tough problems together. And what we'll try to do is we'll have a series of lightning rounds because there's so many topics to talk about. We've identified a few of them. And we'll try to do some quick lightning rounds with your collective permission. And we're going to start with the topic of where I ended around what is the future for the next 80 years coming out of the past 80 of the Bretton Woods institutions. And so maybe, Gayle, I'd love to start with you first, if you don't mind, and then Vera, turn to you, and then Asim, bring you in. And feel free to react also to what each other are saying in your remarks. But Gayle, just starting with you, you have been a huge leader in this space, and so much of your career in helping us think through how some of these institutions actually work and reaching their full potential, obviously when you were at USAID, but many other organizations as well. Where do you see the future of the Bretton Woods institutions? What should world leaders, what should our students be thinking about for the next 80 years? Would love to have you start first.
Thanks. And you said a couple of times, with our collective permission, we'll do X, Y, and Z. Okay, we'll sign up. A couple things on this, on how to think about this. First of all, these institutions are about to be 80 years old. It's kind of wise to think about reforming or modernizing institutions every 80 years or so, right? Like that hasn't happened is point number one. So one of the things that needs to happen is there needs to be a more iterative process of looking at how these institutions are working, how effectively or not effectively, and how they need to morph and change. over time, because if we get it set up for the next 80 years and wait 80 years, we're not going to solve any problems. Second, we're going to have to think more about some of the unanticipated problems that arise, and Vera may speak to both of these, but if you look at a cycle of debt coming out of the pandemic, for example, a huge number, particularly low-income countries, are in serious levels of debt. And unlike wealthy countries that were able to spend $14 trillion to shore up their economies, they had no choice but to chip away at the little, if any, liquidity they had and at their own economies. So a second thing we need to think about is how do we make these institutions relevant for what are transnational challenges, not just the country by country model, but if you think about pandemics and the future we're going to face on global health threats, which is there are more of them coming, climate change, the economic volatility that is now worldwide, given without a more interconnected global economy, how do we make these institutions relevant, not just on a country basis, but also a regional, in fact, global basis? They aren't now. Third thing I think to think about is who's at the table. A former colleague of mine was fond of saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, which is kind of true. And if you go back to the history that you were talking about when these institutions were created, many of the countries that they are now focused on investing in the most, right? It's no longer Europe as it was initially. They were colonies or they were at war when these institutions were built. So how do we rethink governance of these institutions, not just so it's more representative and equitable, which it should be in principle, but so that it's got more of a sense at the governance level of how the world actually works. It's how the G7 thinks the world works, how I may think the world works. I grew up in this country. I've got a certain perspective. Isn't necessarily how it works. And that perspective needs to be at the table. Finally, and the last thing I will say about this is in the context of, I like to say modernizing rather than reforming these institutions, because I think it's, as you suggest, about making them relevant for the next 80 years and not just tweaking around the edges. You've also got to think about where they fit in the global architecture. And whether, I mean, one of my concerns, for example, I'm fully for all the pushes to modernize the World Bank. But if we were highly successful there, but we are not also looking at things like the terms of trade, cost of capital, how the world manages risk, and how that works, private capital flows, how foreign assistance from any country, including the US, works. If we're not thinking about the other pieces of the architecture, I think we could have improved performance and impact by the World Bank, but totally insufficient impact. Kind of really bring about the transformation.
Well, that's a perfect transition. Vera, actually, if we could bring you in, because you've had a really illustrious career in many leadership positions, including at the World Bank and at the IFC. Would love to bring you in to react and to build on what Gayle just said.
Thank you very much. I don't know, there is a background sound coming in from somewhere, things are dropping, so maybe there's somebody beside a mic that I can hear. No, once again, thanks a lot for inviting me to this conversation, and it's always a treat to listen to the panelist. So I wanted to talk about four things, and maybe I start a little bit by telling a story. You say that it's been 80 years. I remember, I think maybe it was 15 years ago or something. Ngozi and Ngozi was just recently with you guys, went to South Korea, and we took a train. We took a fast train to Busan. And when we got there, Ngozi was saying how, fantastic it was, and it was just so great, and how quickly we had done it, and everything was so easy. It was even better than checking in at Heathrow Airport. If Heathrow is the best checking experience we have had, because I had insurance. And then, then she sits down. Of course, she was the managing director of the World Bank at the time, and we start having the meeting, and the Minister of Finance or the Prime Minister, I can't remember who it was, and he says to her, wonderful that you're here. We're talking about improving aid effectiveness. There was the Busan conference on aid effectiveness. And, this is amazing and all that. And he goes, but this metro rail that you drove and that you so kindly talk about and we are so proud of, when we decided to do it, we went to the World Bank for financing, and the World Bank told us no. And so Ngozi sort of, jumps. And he goes, no, that's because, you're changing, and, that we can only fund education and health and this, and, the rate of return was not good. But 3 years later, he was telling us everybody's taking it now and it's making so much money. 80 years before, so some years before that, when the World Bank started, the IBRD at the time, Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the first loan that we did was to France. For what? For a railway. So if you just go backwards, and of course today, the World Bank is not funding any railway on the continent of Africa, at least. And that's because we say that the rates of return don't work. And of course, we're fighting on what gauge we should be using. And so this is just to give you a sense of an institution that does certainly, even if maybe we did what we were meant to do when we started, we're not doing that, and we haven't come far into the future enough. So we're sort of stuck in the middle somewhere. And I think this illustrates where we are. The good news is there is recognition that something has to change, and we need to move into the next 80 years differently, in a bigger, better, bolder way. And what does that mean? Essentially, it means that we need more resources. The resources that we're giving to these institutions to do the work that they are asked to do is so much less, given the requirements and the needs that if you think about it, for IDA, which is the Port for the Poorest, the International Development Association port, if we're just looking at successes and failures, we are giving IDA today less resources than we were putting in IDA 12 years ago. The problems today, of course, are the poly crisis. We have crisis galore. So it's not, at 12 years ago, remember, we were just, the sort of global growth was taking off. Everybody, we're talking about overheating. We had stopped talking about decoupling. We were all coupled and everybody was growing and everybody was happy. And then IDA was getting a lot more resources than it is getting today, when essentially the world is on fire and we have madness, strikes and conflict across the globe, and climate change has added to that tension. So clearly the resource question, the investment question, I think is probably for me the most important and the biggest problem that is needed today. Now, if we cannot do the investment problem in sort of the multilateral institutions, I think something that we have not focused enough on is the National Development Bank. So of course, also the regional development banks are very important, and we need to continue to fund them. The African Development Bank in the case of Africa, but the Inter-American Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank. But national development banks now play a very important role in development. National development banks and national private sector. And we have not been able, I think, to pull together the kind of coalition that is needed to strengthen them. We continue in many of our policies still to say we will give guarantees only to the foreigners who come to invest. Risk only the foreigners who come to invest. We will. So if you take an example in India, the Tata Group in Nigeria, the Dangote Group will not benefit from a World Bank guarantee, right? Whereas they are as large as an investor as anybody can get. But we will give Danone, or we will give Total Energies or somebody who comes onto the continent a guarantee to do the investment. And I think we need to change that conversation a bit. The positive there is that we're working much more with the private sector. But we need to sort of, I think these institutions need to do more and better with the private sector. There needs to be a substantial shift into believing that the private sector is a force for good. There still is, because in the beginning, when many of these institutions were formed, the private sector there was suspicion. In the United States 80 years ago, there were still the commerce clauses, the sort of competition policy, even in Europe. The private sector was bad. It was oligopolies all over the place. It was Lee Iacocca and all that. And so I think the institutions have grown with that notion that, maybe the private sector is not as friendly. But I think in the world where we stand, where we need de-risking and blending and more credit enhancements, you need that. The other thing that we clearly need, of course, so we need more resources, we need more work with the private sector in a different way, strengthening of local private sector, working with national development banks, and finally, the teams that are in these institutions. I think the people that are there, to some extent, need a different set of expertise. 80 years ago, we were not worried about climate change. We were not worried about AI. We were not worried about, you know, a slew of other things that today are sort of the plagues of our existence. And I think we need, or even getting the right private sector staff to put together a proposal and a project that will work. And so I think you need that kind of expertise to sort of, if you go to countries now and they tell you my biggest problem is cybersecurity, I don't know that the institution where it's sitting has the expertise to answer and solve those problems. If we're trying to get to e-government, which will be more efficient and hopefully more productive for everybody, it's not clear that we have the expertise that is needed for that. And so I believe that some changes on the way. The World Bank has changed its mandate, and it's now on a livable planet, and there is more climate scientists coming into the institution, as is the EIB and a lot of other institutions. But I think you need a lot more of that as well.
Great, Vera, thank you so much. And Asim, just to turn to you to build on what they said or react, but also if you could link it to get to our second topic, also around your thoughts around localization. So as you think about both global and what we need to kind of be rethinking, I know you also have a lot of thoughts about how this is actually playing out today around issues around localization.
Great. Let me try and tie some of these themes together. So first of all, just to be clear, this system was very effective, and Fatma, you alluded to it in the beginning. So I think we should also recognize that the areas it succeeded, and it was successful, I think, for a very particular reason, which we tend to forget, which is we were coming. It wasn't just the North was rich and the South was poor. The South was coming out from wars. So the idea of this Marshall Plan way of doing development, because I want the narrative to be the South was always bad and somehow it's now gotten better and we should change. The South actually was pretty strong way before the North was even stronger. So there's this period in which the South gets weak, which is a post-war period where it needs both money and knowledge. And so these institutions are set up as a way of delivering money and knowledge in a really rapid way. But I would argue that was a period which worked. It wouldn't have worked before that period. It doesn't quite work now. It's only that particular window where it was very effective. And as you think about this, whether it's relevant or not, or what it means to be localized or not localized, I actually think this question of making multilaterals relevant is not a question I'm particularly interested in. Who cares, is my view of this. They will have to figure out whether they're going to remain relevant or not. Let them figure it out. I think they'll struggle with it. I think eventually they will figure some way out. I think the question we should be asking collectively is what is the ecosystem you want to develop, which will give you the kind of growth and development and inclusivity we want, right? And I would just say three things in that. The first is, again, coming back to this realization that knowledge and resources don't flow from north to south only. Recognizing that for a lot of we need to do now, there is knowledge, there is resources that are available locally. You know, we keep talking about inequality in the world and decry it and how terrible it is. Well, guess what? That 1% isn't all in the US. You know, Vera mentioned Dangote. Every single country I can think of, no matter how struggling it is, will actually have individuals who care or live or are from that country. They may not necessarily be physically living in that country, who can deploy massive resources in that country. It's time to call them out and say, come back home, invest back home, not because you should feel good for charitable reasons, but because you can make money in ways no one else can and do good. So I think it's very important to recognize this flow. The second is what I alluded to earlier, just change how we think of development from we talked about this earlier, it's not a charitable act, it's an investment act, right? And I don't necessarily just want to say that's only the private sector investing. Public investment should have return as well. Non-profit investment should have return as well as private sector investment. I would add a third group to this mix. We've talked about sort of public entities, multilateral entities. Vera talked about private entities. I agree with a lot of what both Vera and Gayle said. I also want to bring the nonprofit sector in. And the reason I want to bring it in, I think we tend to think of the nonprofit sector as go where the state isn't willing to go or go where the state has collapsed. I think this is the wrong way to think of the nonprofit sector. The right way to think about the nonprofit sector is it's a place where innovation happens. Let me explain that for a second. We think of the private sector being innovators. They're actually not. True innovation is not profitable. True innovation does not have a good ROI ever. True innovation is done by crazy people, most of who will fail completely. But they do it because they just love it. Their return is not financial. Their return is they're obsessed. Every single big idea in the world, I would argue, is created by someone who wasn't thinking of the profit motive, who was just a crazy nutter who wanted to do something. So when we bring in the nonprofit sector, we should recognize that in your countries, the nonprofit sector is not there to replace a failing state or to give an excuse for a state not to work. It's there to push ideas which no one has the courage to do. And then at that point, the private and non-public sector enter to scale up, to commercialize their ideas. And I think this relationship, when we think of development, I would argue we should think of development as this ecosystem where we're trying to get the right ingredients for all of these actors to kind of play the role they should be playing. And in that world, what the multilaterals need to do is just get out of the way. Stop blocking it. Stop exuding power. Stop exercising veto power. These are the kind of things, you don't need to do stuff, you just sometimes need to, we don't even necessarily need to be on the table. Just don't make that table to be the only table that people should be listening to. There are many other tables. And in some tables, you will be the menu. In other tables, we can be the menu. I think that's kind of the way to do it. This localization versus decolonization, I've always wanted to say this, Fatma, to you, which is, I disagree with the premise of the question.
I know, that's what I wanted it to you.
I don't like this idea. This whole localization to me is just BS. Sorry, it's BS because I feel like you act as if you, the colonialists, are there willing to give us power now. We don't need your power. We don't need to wait for you to say, okay, now you should set up an NGO in Kinshasa so that we can get USAID money. No offense. Okay? So we can get USAID money. So instead of Adam Smith International, now we have Kinshasa International. Who cares, right? I want to say you in the developing world, and this is, by the way, for you guys as well. You're laughing right now, but a lot of you are desperate to get jobs with these organizations. Forget it. These are organizations of the past. Don't be desperate to come to me and say, can we get a World Bank job or USAID job? They are amazing organizations in your parts of the world. Look at them first. And when you look at those organizations, you will not be a cog in the machine or a mascot to put in front for some meeting because we didn't have someone with a certain color of skin showing up there. You will be one of those from those places who are recognized and given leadership roles, and by the way, have the networks and context to make a huge difference. And so this idea of localization to me is very different. It's simply saying, this is already happening, by the way. They are amazing players. All you need to do is go join them. Come to Harvard, obviously, we can help you as well. But go back, join these organizations, and I think that will create a totally different kind of sort of local force, which is not sort of devolved by giving someone else's authority to you. You're creating it, and then these organizations will have no choice but to listen to you.
Okay, perfect to come in on that.
Sure. And I wasn't offended at all. Look, I agree. I think this localization stuff it's at risk of being turned into a silver bullet. Now the big thing everybody's talking about is localization. Something we agree on. Stop with the silver bullets, right? First of all, bullets are something you use to hurt other people. But the notion that there is a singular thing that is going to bring about development, make everything equitable, end poverty, make everyone healthy, there isn't. And this community, this field, has a history of getting hooked on the thing. Every 3 or 4 years, there's a new thing that is going to fix everything. So I think localization has the danger of becoming the new thing. And I think, therefore, we have the risk of a lot of projects that you can show are more localized. But at the transformational level, at the systemic level, it's not going to make that much difference. And I think our challenge on the development side is to figure out two things. How can we, at the systemic level, bring about change? But at the local level, model what's possible. Because when you've got those two things, then you can get the investment that you talk about. And we don't tend to do that, right? We keep looking for the silver bullet. So I would say there are a few things that we need to think more about in terms of what do we need to actually deal with this thing called development. The first one is I keep coming back to systems and scale. You talked about innovation. I think a lot about social entrepreneurs and some of the brilliant things that I have seen come up, you rightly say, out of the nonprofit civil society sector in developing countries. We as the world suck at bringing any of those to scale. When I was at USAID, it was one of my biggest frustrations. We did some brilliant partnerships with extraordinary innovators, and it was like 1,000 points of light. It wasn't, how do we take something that is this big a game changer and take it to scale is one big part of it.
Why was that so hard?
I think it's so hard, and really, I don't think the world's done it since, did I go off?
No, you're good.
Okay, since oral rehydration salts, which were, that was what, 65 years ago or something. And how did that happen? It got in the pipeline of all the international institutions and systems. I think because innovation is a silver bullet, that everybody has an innovation lab or an innovation committee or an innovation project. And that's number one. So we don't think about it as a, I don't know, it's like a fad, right? The second is we don't think about how to capitalize it in a sustainable way. When the private sector goes to work on a new electric car, they look about how to finance it sustainably so they can capture the whole market, get in every country in the world. We don't do that. We look at financing in a very linear, oh, this is a great little project. If we could get a little first loss capital, we don't think about scale in terms of our investment model. And the third piece is a lot of social entrepreneurs just don't have access to the capital or the institutions that have the capital. And we don't have very many instruments that are good at that level. It's like the problem with SME financing. We've never really developed a product. They're too small to get real money, but they're too business-like to get aid money. That's a solvable problem.
Just on this, the DOD is a good example with Lincoln Labs, just our neighbors. So I don't even know Lincoln Labs. Lincoln Labs is MIT's kind of research laboratory. Lincoln comes up with the craziest ideas, LiDARs and stuff like that, all sorts of funky things. The DOD pays Lincoln not just to develop the idea, it actually pays Lincoln to then hand over the idea to a private sector company who would scale it. And so there's actual resources given to recognize that this scale-up problem is not just something that will naturally happen. There's a whole bunch of challenges between initially creating your first LiDAR and then getting every car, getting into like the Nissans and the Fords, right? And that requires someone to come in commercially with some.
But see, DOD thinks this way because in the hard power world, in my experience,
The
Department of Defense, you're thinking big, you're thinking long term, you're thinking being in charge of the world, you're thinking big picture. And in the soft power world, I don't think this field is sufficiently recognized as needing to have that same kind of reach and impact, nor does it assert itself that way. So I think that's another.
I want to bring Vera in, and we're going to try to turn in 5 minutes to your Q&As so you can get those ready. Vera, I would love to bring your perspectives in. We started with localization, but we've now gotten into too small to succeed versus too big to fail. So wherever you'd like to come in on that spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's a summary of the African continent until we realize that we're too big. So we are 2% of GDP, we're 2% of growth, sort of exports in the world, and I work in Basel now with something like 0.07% of total capital assets in the world. So why should I wake up in the morning and bother? I think until also, I think part of this conversation is that, and I say this seriously, is that there is need for a recognition. I think today, you go to India and whether or not they succeed is a different story. Vietnam did it differently. India's sole objective is to become better than China. And, they are dreaming of the 7% growth in 15 years and sort of putting everything in that process. And my sense is that as was said, the MDBs are not going to develop us, for God's sakes. You know, these countries have to develop themselves. We have to develop ourselves. Let me just be clear. And until we have a vision that says we can do it, of course, we don't have the advantage of 80 years ago, cheap labor, and we need labor market data to understand how our labor markets even function. And until I think if there is not the French say sursaut, if there is not a desire inwardly to, let me take an example. You know, African leaders woke up one day and decided, oh my God, we need our historic artifacts back. And they started drumming the table. And all of a sudden, the British Museum was giving it back, and Togo was giving something, and Nigeria was having something. And so we've done that so well. We can actually do it in that space. Can we decide one morning that we no longer want corruption and that we want to use resources effectively, and that we're going to make sure that they go to the most effective growth enhancing part of our economies? And I think once we do that and demonstrate internally that these things are possible, and are able to, under this AFCFTA, crowd knowledge to where it can be the most efficient, like Kenya has done, make Kenya an IT hub of the continent, so that, you know, everybody can come there and bring the capital that is needed, which then eventually will be shared if we adopt the CFTA. I think we will always be talking about what Gayle spoke about, right? Is this too small to succeed and too big and not big enough to fail, right? We will always be caught in that middle. And I think at least for Africa, until we are able to show and demonstrate that our scale matters and that our scale is a market that must be reckoned with. Today, everybody's afraid of our migrants, right? Of our people. But those people are also our biggest treasure, right? And if we were able to, with the right governance environment, use the resources that we had to divert them to the things that, you know, those, I mean, Gayle just spoke about amazing innovations. I always give the example of M-Pesa in Kenya, right? Everybody talked about M-Pesa. We're using M-Pesa in New York City, but we don't use M-Pesa in Nigeria, and we don't use M-Pesa in Angola. Why? So for me, these are, and I don't know who is in the room, but you guys, we need to learn from each other. We need to build one big, you know, too big to fail economy. And until we build a too big to fail economy, we will just be, you know, nice cherry picking. One day I have one story, you know, some leader is coming and I can tell a story about a fantastic thing I did in Malawi. I'm going to move the dial.
Yeah.
So this is a really great transition. Vera, you have about 100 students in the room here, all across all schools at Harvard, from undergraduates to masters, PhDs, some postdocs, fellows, some faculty as well. And the reason I'm saying that out loud is we tee up questions. And who's going around with the mic? Rahul will go around the mic, so you can just raise your hand. We'll try to do a few rounds. The reason I'm saying that, the kind of dots I want to connect, is what I'm hearing from this conversation is, even as we think through the next 80 years, perhaps what we're all trying to take back is our own slice of our own agency. And it's not going to be up to, what Asim's point is, it's not going to be up to any one institution or organization to solve for a lot of this, but it's up to each of us in our own ecosystems. And just looking in this room, and I know will be followed online as well, each of you represent your own national, local ecosystems, right? And what is the power of your own individual talent to match up with collective talent from your own home systems that can do some of this, are things to think about. I know, Asim, I'm sure you had reactions to what Vera just said about Pakistan. I know that maybe that can come out in some of your Q&A. And Gayle, maybe it also in the Q&A, if you could bring up any thoughts that you have, because I know some of our students are interested about the US election and what that means for some of this conversation, or could mean as well. Say one last thing before we
just the one last thing I would say, because I think what Vera's hit on is, and you're reinforcing there, is really key. And it's the one thing we don't talk about, we don't measure when we talk about development. It's political capital, right? What political capital are we as individuals willing to invest? I have worked with Vera on things where African leaders did decide to invest in political capital in some of the pandemic response. But that's the thing. What's the political capital the United States is willing to invest in this? So that's a space that I think we could all focus on much, much more.
I love that. All right, so we've got the mic. Where's Rahul? All right, here we go. Put your hands up high so you can see. We'll try to do a few rounds. If you guys could just kind of capture, and I'll try to capture as well, and we'll try to get through some. So Rahul, go ahead. You get to pick. You get agency to pick. Yeah, Brian, you can pick the next, and then you go ahead, stand up, introduce yourself.
Oh, hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm an MPP1 student. My name is Wen Yu, and I am from China. My question relates to, I'll try to keep it short. My question relates to a lot of conversations are surrounded on the topic of multilateral corporations, multilateral organizations being big, expanding to extend the webs to local places, either collaborating with local organizations or hearing the advice from local organizations. My question is that would such expansion come at the cost of efficiency? Because the organizations themselves are already very big, and for example, bank has like 5 branches. So would that cause the time frame of carrying out the project to be even longer? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Venu. We're got in the back over here.
Yes.
And just name your program, try to deconstruct the acronym for our guests, and then we'll just go right to the question.
Milica from Serbia, doing education policy and analysis at HAXI. My question is, where is education in this future? Because next week there is UN Convention on Future, and versus the other years, education is actually not going to be analyzed as a topic. So where is it in economic development architecture of the future?
Great.
Okay, thank you. My name is Sisai Elisa. I'm from Ethiopia, and I'm doing the master in the MPA in International Development, MPID. So my question is, when thinking about, I think, global economic development architecture, development aid is one thing, but I think mobilizing private finance is also essential. And my question is, Africa, you know, like as a continent, I think it has a higher cost of borrowing for development finance. So my question is there any, you know, like work going on with the development finance institution to help Africa lower the cost of borrowing? Thank you.
Great. And let's do one more, Brian, in the back. Great.
Yeah, thank you so much. Nicholas Perringer from the MPA in International Development. Specifically to Asim, you spoke very inspiringly about scaling up innovative practices within development. I'm wondering, what are some practically applicable ways that we can do that? Because shifting a mindset to be the DoD seems quite intractable relative to more specific interventions or platforms. Thanks.
Great. So why don't we start there? Who wants to? There's different categories. Don't feel like it's take all of them.
Let me touch on the first and the last, and I'd like to say that I'm a third the expert on that, on the cost of capital.
And I'll take
You're
the
Mr.
education.
Education. Your question is a really good one. Is with more of this consultation, local involvement, wouldn't that make my mic stop? Wouldn't that slow things down? And we already know that one of the biggest problems is that the time it takes for a project to be realized. I think it would if it's just another thing added to the list. As you design a project, now you must talk to some local people or set up a new commission or a new body. I think a lot of it is in some of the fundamentals of how these institutions work. For example, Vera pointed to whether the World Bank works with the African Development Bank in Africa. By doing that, there's a different perspective coming in on the ground immediately. Governance of these institutions. If you look at governance of the World Bank, it is overwhelmingly skewed towards the donors. And some of that is probably smart if you want to keep that capital flowing, and not surprising. That's the way a lot of things work. But there are ways that that can be shifted. If you look about the addition, for example, of an African seat to the G20, there's that kind of thing where the conversation then changes at the level of governance, because it's not just the perspective of the wealthy donor countries. So that's yet another way to do it. So I would think about it less from the kinds of things we've conventionally typically done, adding a person here or there, holding a special meeting, consultation, and a lot of those are very nice box checking exercises that don't make a big difference at the end of the day, to thinking structurally how do you think about these institutions and how they operate and how they're built that would enable them to have a deeper perspective, including locally? So I would think about it that way. The last one was on getting to scale. Look, I think there are a few ways to think about it. One is that there hasn't really been much work collectively to figure out how do we build pipelines, right? There's the occasional festival every 12 or 18 months that 10 really cool entrepreneurs come and maybe somebody throws some money at them. If we want to think systematically, I'm on the board of the Skoll Foundation, for example, which does a lot of support to social entrepreneurs. And one of the things we're thinking about is scale and how do you connect these social entrepreneurs to their governments and to the sources of capital. Because if you think about it from a government perspective, if you've got a local entrepreneur that has a solution for cost-effective, affordable solution for off-grid power, you can do a project that's funded by USAID and it's great. People come see it. Members of Congress will come see it and they'll put more money in the budget. Or you can connect to the government. And so when the government is looking at electricity countrywide, production countrywide, that social entrepreneur is brought into the mix, whether in the eyes of government planning or bank or other financing. How do we do that? These communities aren't connected. And I think the third is thinking about your model of DoD. What's relevant there is bring some of the private sector in on the ground floor and some of the private capital in on the ground floor. There is private capital out there that's willing to take more risk. We don't systematically bring them on the ground floor. And then some of those entrepreneurial innovations, I think they're private sector companies. What DoD does is they identify the companies that are going to want something like this. We can do the same thing on the development side. We just don't do it. We are a community that, in my view, is way too projectized. Projects are great. They have impact on real people. They are not transformational unless they can be brought to scale. They're projects. And that's great. I'm not against projects. But we've got to start thinking about scale rather than, my biggest disappointment at AID is I felt like we had a huge mountain of wildly successful one-offs.
Gayle, thank you so much. Vera, I'd love to bring you in and then we'll close out with Asim.
No, thanks a lot to all the people who asked questions. Very good questions. I think let me link the question on cost of capital to the one on NDB's local, whether we should work with the locals or not. I think on the cost of capital, three things. One of them is, countries just need to have good macroeconomic fundamentals. There is no way that you could sort of spin that cut differently. And it is important, it's essential. The good thing about it is that between 2020 and 2010, in Africa again, but across the world, all the way to Bangladesh, I think low-income economists demonstrated that they had finally understood what it meant to have good macroeconomic fundamentals. Overall, the macroeconomic aggregates were doing well, growth was going up. We had, the highest sort of growth run since the 60s in development. However, we still had a very shallow financial markets. Financial markets are not robust enough, and as long as you have non-robust financial markets, it's very difficult for the private sector to come in because cash is king, and if they cannot convert, that doesn't work. We also went out into the private sector, but we didn't have all the fundamentals that were needed for credit rating agencies to rate us. Then the credit rating agencies also had a bias, a perception issue, and so that perception issue was penalizing us even more. And so essentially, we get credit ratings that have a perception issue, a liquidity premium, hence my title. I created the liquidity and sustainability facility to deal with that bit of the cost of capital. But the most fundamental issue around cost of capital is governance. I don't want us to skirt around this issue. Governance is so important. If you don't have good governance, because essentially the cost of capital is somebody's betting on the fact that you're going to take their resources and do the right project within the time that you're promising, so that the rate of return of that project is high enough so that you can pay them back. If they believe that you cannot do that, then they anticipate that you cannot do that. So the cost of capital is very high because they want to make all their money upfront before you become too corrupt or before you collapse. And so essentially that's the game that is being played. And so we must have good governance. If we do not have good governance, we will continue talking about what the rating agencies are doing. Now, the reason why, another way of bringing down the cost of capital is working with, for example, national development banks, and Gayle said it really well. National development banks essentially can take first loss without additional capital because they're on ground. They can run around and change policy, get the land permit, get the water connected, get the energy connected. A foreign company that needs to mobilize its resources to come and do that, it shows up in the cost of the project and it becomes so expensive. And so if we had international institutions working a little bit with the local companies and transferring some of that knowledge, so that this first loss part of the project can be done quickly by locals, and the foreigners can then come in with the innovation and the technology, and this way education comes in and do it, then I think the two meet in a way that is optimal for everybody. Aid is never going to develop the continent. Markets are going to develop the continent. Responsible debt is going to develop the continent, but with huge emphasis on the responsible. And some of the debt does not necessarily have to have an immediate high rate of return. It has to be debt which builds leveraging infrastructure. If you build a good road, the private sector can come in and build housing that will then have a rate of return. So I think we also need to look at it not only in the scale of the project, but in the scale of the holistic nature of the development process that we want to put in place.
Vera, thank you so much. And Asim, I'm sorry, we only have like 2 minutes or so we'll have to wrap up, but would love to bring in some of your thoughts. And then, of course, Asim is here at Harvard at the Kennedy School, so please feel free to follow up directly with him afterwards as well.
Do you know something about education?
Yes. Let me just respond very quickly.
I was not trying to shortchange education.
On the scaling up, I just wanted to double down on what Gayle just said, which is, I'll give you a very tangible example. We don't even have DOD. I've been in a discussion with a bunch of really rich Pakistanis, and I'm saying, guys, some of them are obsessed about bringing Khan Academy and Khan Migo to Pakistan, which I think is insane for lots of reasons, long discussion. And I'm saying there's enough innovation happening in Pakistan. Just set up an education investment fund. And even if you only fund like 5 out of 500 applications, that doesn't matter. Because the fact that 500 people will apply and will get shortlisted and get recognized, that's going to promote social innovation in a very tangible way. And you are coming in to scale. They're all looking for scaling. They've done like the 100 school or 50 school. They're now looking to go to 50,000 kids or whatever, and you can help them do it. I'll let you know if I succeed, but that's a very tangible, simple. It's a very mini, it's not DOD, but it's like a baby version of DOD. On education, where's the education gone? Let me just say 2 things. One, on Africa. Africa is not we all say Africa is a future. It's not as if it's a choice. It's a reality. The only places in the world which are going to produce people are Africa, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. By the way, not India and not Bangladesh either, and definitely not China, and definitely not Europe. So you don't have a choice. If you're going to have the future be talented, the only place you're going to find the future is in Africa and a few parts in South Asia. So I actually think it's a universal responsibility for our own selfish interest to actually invest in talent in these parts of the world, because guess what? A lot of them will leave that part of the world, and that's fine. Some of you are here, and you will help the world grow, right? You don't make America great again by investing only in America. You make America great again by investing in the world, right? On education, some politics. On education, the only thing I would say is it's our loss. We in the field of education, and I blame myself and my Hugsy colleagues in doing this, we made ourselves irrelevant in education. Why? Because we got obsessed with test scores. We told the growth guys and the macro guys, don't talk to us because we have nothing to say on growth and macro, which is the dumbest thing to have done in the long term. We are the ones who know how growth, if you ask a macroeconomist, how do you get growth going? What are you going to say? Raise TFP? What the hell does that even mean? We are the ones in education who can tell you, if you invest in human capital, this is that TFP-A thing that you're solo residual, that's the damn thing. We gave up on that collectively. We need to get back onto it and say, in education, education is about growth. It's not just about test scores and doing well in PISA.
Can you say quickly a word on Gear Up? so people can follow up?
We are setting up a group in CID, which is just going to focus on education, exactly with this mindset to say it's a systems view, it's a systemic change view, and it's education which is going to lead for better society's growth, both in the economic sense of growth, but also, frankly, in the social sense of growth.
So look, I know we're at time, but a couple of things. This is to get started, not to finish, right? And I know many of you in this room, you're part of our CID community. These are the types of conversations we want to continue having. You guys have to solve 4, right? So a couple of threads to go forward. First, just to say, for those of you interested, Asim talked about the Gear Up initiative. We're also launching new initiatives right now at CID on issues like China, which will be launching officially in a couple of weeks at Worldwide Week. We are looking at social protection issues, economic growth, micro, macro, a lot of these areas. So take a look at our website. Second, we're launching new development seminars starting in just a couple of weeks. We have Asim Tahir here. Asim, just stand up so they know who you are. October will be Development Finance Month at CID. He'll be launching seminars, there'll be events, there'll be workshops. So for those of you who want to go deeper into some of those topics, come to see Wasim. Mara Ballas is in the back. She's now with CPL, but she's a forever CID. She's doing one on gender and what the gender lens will look like in international development. We have Claudia Lopez with us, who's going to look the former mayor of Bogota, Colombia. She's launching a seminar for all of you to look at what urban governance looks like, particularly from the Latin American context, but how that's applicable globally. So the conversations that Gayle and Vera have been working on for so many years, this is not the first panel that they've been on, I'm sure it's not going to be your last, that as we look to solve for some of these issues, as we look to tackle them from very different angles, we want all of you to be at the table, right? These are the types, and Gayle and Vera, as you guys are thinking through spaces you're in, I hope you see the next generation of talent here at Harvard CID. And it's not just those of us here at Harvard, it's our global networks all around the world and the communities we bring into the conversation all around the world. So we're so grateful, Vera. Thank you so much for joining us virtually online. And Vera is at the Brookings Institution, but wears many hats. So please feel free to follow up with Dr. Songwe. Gayle has been kind and generous enough. We have her for another 45 minutes or so. We're going to move over to the CID Commons, to the Perkins Room. For those of you that want to have a more career conversation, Gayle has one of the most illustrious careers in this space. Ask her how she did it. Ask her how you can be her. Ask her what you should not do in her journey. We'll continue that career conversation shortly down the way as well. Thank you, all of you, especially for those of you that are having to stand for the last 50 minutes. I don't envy you, and I appreciate that you stood with us for that journey, literally. Thanks for being part of this, and a huge thanks also to the Kennedy School's Candid and Constructive Conversation series to model what tough but respectful conversations can also look like, because they're tough, complex challenges that we all face. So thank you guys so much.